Classification of artificial satellites based on orbit inclination, types of satellites based on the orbital size or altitude, different types of satellites based on the orbital shape, various types of satellites based on the principle of operation and based on the purpose or application. Based on inclination, equatorial orbit, polar orbit satellites, inclined orbit satellites. Equatorial orbit, inclination angle is 0. The orbital plane of satellite coincides with the orbital plane of equator. Polar orbit, inclination angle is 90 degrees. The satellite in a polar orbit passes over the earth poles. Inclined orbit, it is of two types, prograde orbit and retrograde orbit. For prograde orbit, inclination angle is 0 to 90 degrees and retrograde orbit, inclination angle is 90 to 80 degrees. The satellite in a prograde orbit moves in the same direction of earth rotation, whereas the satellite in retrograde orbit moves in opposite direction of earth rotation. Based on the orbital size, lower earth orbit, whose altitude is 500 km to 1500 km, medium earth orbit, whose altitude ranges from 5000 km to 15,000 km, geosynchronous orbit or geostationary orbit, altitude around 35,786 km from the earth's surface. Next, classification of satellites based on orbital shape or orbit rotation. Circular orbit and elliptical orbit satellites. For circular orbit, eccentricity is 0. The satellite in a circular orbit rotates with constant speed and constant altitude. Example for circular orbit is geostationary orbit. Whereas the satellite in elliptical orbit, whose eccentricity not equal to 0, rotates with variable speed and with varying altitudes. Example for elliptical orbit is geotransfer orbit. Based on the principle of operation, satellites are of two types, active satellites and passive satellites. In active satellites, for signal processing, electronic equipment exists. It amplifies the signal, changes the frequency of the signal, and retransmits the signal back to the earth. In active satellites, uplink frequency is greater than downlink frequency, whereas in passive satellites, uplink frequency and downlink frequency is same. The satellite doesn't have any active components. No onboard signal processing operation takes place in passive satellites. This passive satellite simply reflects the signal back to earth. Based on the purpose or application, communication satellites for TV, radio and internet transmission, navigation satellites. These satellites provide positioning data, NAVIC, GPS and GLONASS. Earth observation satellites monitor weather, that is atmospheric conditions, environment and disasters. Military satellites is used for surveillance and defense. Scientific satellites is used to conduct space and planetary research. Remote sensing satellite capture the images of the earth's surface. Astronomical satellites are used to study the celestial bodies. Biosatellites are used to conduct the biological experiments in space.